On the question of context, the tradition of hypnosis that I was recalling before reminded me of the risk of simulation. So, for instance, this dialogue between Charcot and Bernard. Bernard spoke of the danger that Charcot's patients were simply in a way reproducing, like actors, the symptoms that Charcot was expecting. And I'm not implying in any way that this something similar is at play, of course, in the mirror neuron system, but since you pay so much attention to the body and you've been yourself critical of fMRI kind of interpretations of what happens in the brain, I was wondering if the specific position of a subject within an fMRI scanner doesn't somehow amplify the response because of the physical position of being, static and looking at an image or not being in a normal interpersonal relationship.
Well, as I always keep telling to my students, when we want to understand something of the human condition by relying on neuroscientific approach, which boils down to putting people into fMRI scanner, so lying down, or recording the electrical activity of their brain by means of EEG or magnetoencephalography, which means being sitting on a chair, is like looking at the world through a peeping hole. I mean, it's an incredibly artificial situation which only vaguely is trying to resemble a real-life situation. But this is the best we can do with the technological limitation as we speak. For example, nowadays, in the case of the neuroscience of non-human primates, there are chronically implanted electrodes that enable you to record from macaques wirelessly when they are freely able to behave in a room like this. So with no constraint, not sitting on a chair, not with the head fixed, but behaving not entirely as they would do in the wild, but still with a much higher degree of ecological plausibility. This type of solution is not available in the case of humans, but I'm quite optimistic. When I started this career, there was no such a thing as fMRI or magnetic MEG, there was no TMS, there was nothing. It was just electrophysiology in experimental animals and a very crude type of electroencephalography. Now we have all this methodology. So I think the ultimate goal is to test the brain body in a situation that is more ecologically plausible. That said, are we influenced by this? Well, there are studies that were able to demonstrate the reliability through repetitive recording of brain activity at different time and simultaneously mapping the plasticity of the response just because we live. And so we are having experiences that in turn affect the way our brain body respond to what we are exposed to. So even taking into account the artificiality, the poor ecological plausibility of the approach, I think we still can understand a lot, even within the present limitation. So I wouldn't be too dismissive in terms of what can be learned even with all the limitation I was highlighting before.
Another maybe provocative question. Discovery of mirror neurons was in a way not planned, it was accidental.
Serendipitous.
But at the same time, I think you said somewhere that the team was ready to discover something.
Oh yeah, by all means.
And I was wondering, since you mentioned Ramachandran and then of course the team here in Parma, if culture, the fact that Italian culture and maybe Indian culture, there is a culture that is attentive to modes of communication that is more embodied than other cultures, didn't put your team in a position, and Rizzolati's team, to be more sensitive to this phenomenon, to be more ready for it?
Well, that's a rather provocative question. I think that more than nationality, by the way, Rizzolati was born in Kiev from a second-generation Italian father and a Russian mother. We are still within the realm of the continent, of continental Europe in that respect. I think what makes the difference, more than the nationality, is the scientific cultural tradition. So the method put forward by Rizzolatti, as I started working as an intern in his lab in 1979, so we go back a lot, unfortunately, it was revolutionary because the standard methodology was to train the monkey to perform a given task, have the monkey performing the task while recording simultaneously the single neuron electrical activity correlating the two. Our approach was completely different, also because Rizzolatti came from neurology and neuropsychology, so the study of human patients. So he tried to apply the same methodology in the lab jargon. What we were doing back then was applying a clinical study of the neurons, which means not just ask one question and see how many of the neurons correlate or do not correlate with their response to that single question, but we were trying to ask as many questions as possible. So while testing motor properties in the motor part of the brain, we were also testing sensory properties, tactile properties, auditory properties, visual properties. Of course, you cannot ask all the possible questions. Possible questions are infinite. But we did our best to ask as many questions as possible to the neuron we were recording from to fully understand the functionality going on in that part of the brain. And it was applying this methodology that motor neuron guiding, orienting movement, or reaching movement turn out to be responsive also to touch and to visual stimuli moved around the very same body part, which led to the discovery that vision can be mapped in the brain not only retinocentric, oculocentric frame of reference, but also in a body-centered frame of reference, which led a few years later neuropsychologists to test hemispatial neglect, asking questions that were never asked before. I say, wait a minute, but can this neglect be dissociated for a peripersonal and extrapersonal space, as Rizzolatti had demonstrated experimentally in non-human primates? And they discovered that also in humans, because if you don't ask, you don't have answer. So this methodology is the outcome of a particular way of doing neuroscience, which, if you ask me to stretch it, is related to the fact that most of us were MD and trained as neurologists. You see, Matelli was a neurologist, Pavesi was an MD, Rizzolatti was an MD, trained as a neurologist, Luciano Fadiga was an MD, Giuseppe Di Pellegrino, who's the first author of the first paper on mirror neurons, was himself an MD and a neurologist. So you look at the brain very differently with a medical background with respect to if you come from computer science or other disciplines or psychology itself. So you ask different questions, and it's a pity that less and less MDs dedicate themselves to neuroscience.
Thanks for that. It confirmed my idea that, depending on the logos, depending on the tradition of thought and the information that one has, one sees different things.
Yeah.
To come to another context, within the authors that I'm interested in, you talked about Tab, but also there are many others, Le Bon, it starts with Plato already. The mimetic behavior of human is most visible and most apparent in collectivity in crowds.
Yeah.
And in the 19th century, there's an entire discipline that emerges in order to study crowd phenomena. And of course, it's more difficult to measure individuals in a crowd. But I was wondering, my intuition is that there is a physiological change that happens when we are part of a collective that renders us more susceptible to it.
Yes. Now, a hot topic in neuroscience, in social neuroscience, is synchronization. Mm-hmm. Synchronization, not just of brain activity, but also of heart activity. When a group of people behaves in a similar way or are exposed to similar stimuli. We published a paper a couple of years ago where we were able to show that if you record heart activity in a group of spectators that are looking at an actorial performance, there is a significant correlation between the way they aesthetically evaluate the performance they attended to and the way the heartbeat synchronize. So the more the hearts synchronize during the performance, the more later on they evaluate aesthetically the performance in a similar way, giving the same grades. There's a colleague of mine who is studying the reception of music in an audience by monitoring with an infrared thermal camera the variation of the skin temperature of the faces of the spectators. And you see that in topic moment of the musical performance, they synchronize. The color of their skin changes simultaneously, which means they are most likely undergoing similar emotion. I would say that definitively an effect of living an experience being a member of a crowd is that this experience gets amplified. So watching a movie in a movie theater when it still was fashionable clearly amplifies your reaction. I remember when I was a kid, and that was the only way to see movies, with the exception of TV. Seeing a funny movie in a movie theater, sometimes you had to go twice because you couldn't listen to the sentences which were crowded by the laughter spreading all over the audience. And the same occurs with other emotions like fear. So there is a multiplying factor which stems from the fact that a given experience is shared by many others. The neuroscience of this sharing of experience is moving its first steps, mainly for technological reasons. I mean, if you ask me, I would like to record simultaneously from 50 people in a movie theater or in a concert hall, but I do not have the means to purchase 50 EEG caps. It's very expensive, it requires a lot of people, but it's technically already feasible in principle. And I think that the more non-invasive methodology will be developed, the more we are going to see neuroscientists investigating what interests you. A very important aspect of mimesis, which is the added value of the people with whom you share the experience.
I look forward to that.
I mean, if you look at if you watch a football game alone, sitting on your couch or sharing the experience in a stadium, there's no match. I mean, it's completely different.
This opens up, we're moving towards the end. You work on cinema.
Yeah.
You've written a book, co-authored a book with Michele Guerra, The Empathic Screen.
Yeah.
And cinema is, of course, a mimetic medium in the sense that it represents or it copied reality, but it also, you pay attention to the way the technology of cinema has an impact on spectators, camera movement, angles, and so forth, in the motor dimension. So I was wondering, since this area of experimental aesthetics that you propose is a promising area of dialogue in mimetic studies, if you could sum up the main insights that emerge from that.
Yeah. One of the many aspects that I really enjoyed of your book is when you underline several times that when we speak of mimesis, we should leave behind the stereotypical account of mimesis of a passive and mechanistic reproduction of what is being imitated, while underlying the creative and active aspect of mimesis, which set into motion practically all parts of our brain and of our body. And of course, the same occurs when we experience movies. This, again, has been intuited a long time ago. And with the help of Michele, I studied a lot for what I could, not as deeply as he could do, because he is a film theorist, and I'm a neuroscientist, but with his guide, I discovered how early on psychologists were interested on the impact that cinema had on spectators, and Hugo Münzenberg is one of the most interesting examples already in 1916. So a few years after a movie, the cinema was invented, he writes this book, The Photoplay, where he asks himself, why is cinema so powerful? Why is cinema driving so much? So many people going to the movies. Why so effective? Because it pulled the very same strings that are pulled by reality. However, just because cinema is a cultural artifact, with all the technicalities like editing, camera movement, the use of sound, close-ups, it reconfigures reality. And through mimesis, with cinema, but also with literature or with paintings, we acquire new knowledge about the world and about ourselves. So that's why I think that you properly stressed that mimesis doesn't mean to have a mere passive replica of what is already out there. Art and cinema, not always, but quite often, is an artistic form of expression. Is artistic specifically because it reconfigures vision, hearing, in such a way that enables you to approach reality in a different way and yourself in a different way. It tells you something reality cannot tell you. It makes visible the invisible, to paraphrase Paul Klee, in a different artistic domain. But the way it works is always through the very same mimetic mechanism that enable you to relate to prosaic reality. It's the very same palette which is being put into action. Although differently, also because the context in which you watch a movie is completely different from the way you relate to emotion and actions in your daily activities. You are still, you are in a dark room, you share the experience with others, all elements that most likely potentiate embodied simulation, the mimetic mechanisms that are at the core of the way we relate to feature films.
Indeed, and so speaking about technology, and now technology is changing very quickly, and in many ways cinema is already a 20th century. This is my last question. We increasingly are exposed to our smartphones and to new kind of simulations that are generated by the internet and shown on all kind of platforms. And Baudrillard had this theory of the hyperreal, saying, well, it's an hyperreality that has nothing to do with reality. I call it hypermimesis because I think that these hyperrealities retroact on the embodied nature of the mimetic subject, and it can have both good and bad effect depending on what is mediated. So I was wondering if you could talk briefly about the two sides of hypermimesis and maybe link it to your recent project.
Yeah, I think postmodern thinkers like Guy Debord, Baudrillard were foreseeing something that is our common experience on a daily basis. So in a way they were prescient. And I think they correctly pointed out that with the development of a certain technology or within a particular economy, financial capitalism, we would designate it today, it is possible to build a replica of reality that becomes more real than reality in itself. You point out, however, that this doesn't mean that these simulacra are not mediated by the very same mechanism of mimesis, and I think you're totally right. And just because I totally agree with you on this point, this poses a lot of questions about what we know about how this new technological dispositive work. You were mentioning iPhones, the smartphone. Well, the smartphone introduces at least two novelties with respect to more traditional technological devices that mediated our experience of audiovisual content. First, it's held by our hands, which means the experience occurs systematically within our peripersonal space, which is the space of proxemics. It is the space we were defending from the intrusion of the virus during the climax of the COVID pandemics. So it is a space which is mapped differently by our brain body with respect to the file space, where we normally had all of our audiovisual experience, be the big screen in a movie theater or the TV set when we watch TV sitting on the couch. And we don't know anything about this new form of mediation. To which extent the experience of audiovisual content, when it occurs within this peripersonal space produces a different emotional impact with respect to experiences occurring far away from our body. Second, the performativity of vision. With a TV set, we have a control of the content by using a remote control, which is a technological device. In cinema, we are totally passive. I mean, we see what's going on the screen, which we can play no control. Here, the control is represented by a part of our body. So that's why I coined the term the skin screen. This is like a skin that we touch with our body, with a part of our body, with our fingers. So all the haptic metaphors that were introduced in the aesthetic debate, Berenson, for example, speaks of the haptic quality of Giotto, which makes Giotto a better painter than his master Cimabue, or within film theory, the phenomenology inspired theories of people that speak of the haptic quality of cinema. Now this haptic quality becomes literal because we literally touch the screen. So this periodic performativity of vision has an impact with the way we understand the experience, the content we behold through the touchscreen or not. We don't know. I wrote an entire ERC project that failed. They didn't like it, so I didn't get the grant, but as I always try to do, I will unpack it in separate different projects. We started already with a part of the impact of auditory immersion in modulating the response of the brain to audiovisual content, and the next step will be specifically this new quality of audiovisual experience mediated by this new technoprosthesis of our body to see whether they introduce modulation and of what kind. So this is what's coming next in our lab.
Is it also something that you're planning to write a book about?
Yeah, well, I'm writing actually a book on the impact of digital technologies on the self, on subjectivity, on who we are. And it will be a very difficult exercise of balance, trying not to be apocalyptic, although it's quite difficult.
It's difficult. We'll have to keep thinking about the two sides of hypermimesis and look forward to that work. So thanks so much for
your work. Se mi togli il corpo io non so dove attaccarmi.